First of all, a warm welcome to all of you here to the beautiful Women's League Synagogue at the Jewish Theological Seminary. If you haven't been here before, I hope it's just the first of many visits to this place. I want to take the opportunity to make sure that you notice the wonderful piece of our art exhibition that you'll find here in the space, over to the left and then behind you. These are beautiful works of textile art by the artist Rachel Cantor. You can read about them over there. And they represent 20% of the inaugural art exhibition of our Arts Advisory Board, which is spread all around the house. And there are many beautiful things that have never been seen before. So I hope you'll take advantage of the opportunity to see the art that we have here at the seminary. At this time, I'd like to remind you all to silence your cell phones. In fact, I'm going to remind myself to silence. Already done. Okay, good. And tonight, we have the Jack and Louis Rudin Lecture. The Rudin Lecture series at JTS provides the opportunity for eminent academics, religious leaders, intellectuals, and public figures to discuss topics of interest with the JTS community and the public at large. Jack and Susan Rudin, who have so generously endowed this series, unfortunately could not be with us this evening, and we'd like to take this opportunity to extend our thanks to them for sponsoring the Rudin Lecture Series, which is named for Mr. Rudin and his late brother, Louis Rudin. We're also happy to be able to welcome a representative of the foundation, our friend, Vice President and Program Director, Mark Bodden. Where is Mr. Thank you so much for being here. Of course, it's my greatest privilege to extend our welcome to tonight's speaker, Dr. Kathleen M. O'Connor, who's sitting to my right, and to tonight's respondents, Dr. Rachel Yehuda and Dr. Michelle Friedman. Thank you so much for being here. And our topic, as you know, is Living in Uncertain Times, Responses to Crisis in the Bible and in Our Own Lives. This program is co-sponsored by the Center for Pastoral Education at JTS, which is supported by generous funding from the Charles H. Revson Foundation, the Rita J. and Stanley H. Kaplan Family Foundation, and the Caring Commission of UJA Federation of New York. At this time, I'd also like to offer a warm welcome to two groups who are joining us tonight. First, to Reverend Julie Johnson Staples and the students in her Beginners Biblical Hebrew class from our good neighbor, the Riverside Church. Welcome to those of you who are here. Thank you. And also to the participants in our post-college Avodah Jewish Service Corps, a program founded by a graduate of the JTS Rabbinical School. Thanks for being here, folks. And now to the business at hand. I'm delighted to be able to introduce tonight's speakers. We'll first hear from Dr. O'Connor and then from our respondents, Drs. Yehuda and Dr. Friedman. Dr. Kathleen M. O'Connor, and with your permission, I'll introduce all three of our speakers right now, is the William Marcellus McFeeters Professor of Old Testament Emerita at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia. No relation to our next-door neighbors. She earned her PhD from the Princeton Theological Seminary and previously taught at the Mary Knowles School of Theology in Ossining, New York. She also has taught frequently in local churches and community groups, and she has taught in Central America, in Thailand, in Japan, and in Ireland. A Henry Luce III Fellowship provided her the time to write her recent book, Jeremiah, Pain and Promise, where she draws upon trauma studies to show how the prophetic book addresses profound suffering. I'm sure you'll be hearing some of the fruits of that work this evening. Her remarkable post-9/11 book, Lamentations and the Tears of the World, received first prize in Scripture from the Catholic Press Association. And it was that book that enabled me to reestablish contact with Professor O'Connor. I have taught courses on Lamentations for 30 years, and I must tell you that I only really started to teach Lamentations in the wake of the publication of that book, which was life-changing for me, and I dare say for many of the students who've had an opportunity to read it with me. And you have my profound thanks, Kathleen, for that wonderful book. Now, our distinguished respondents. Dr. Rachel Yehuda is Professor of Psychiatry and Neuroscience and Director of the Traumatic Stress Studies Division at Mount Sinai School of Medicine. She also is the Mental Health Patient Care Center Director at the James J. Peters Veterans Affairs Medical Center. And Dr. Yehuda has published widely in the field of traumatic stress. Dr. Michelle Friedman is Director of Pastoral Counseling at the Open Orthodox Rabbinical Seminary Yeshivat Chovavei Torah and an Associate Clinical Professor of Psychiatry at Mount Sinai School of Medicine. And she devotes much of her professional time to the interface of psychiatry and religious life. So you're in for a treat to hear the interface between biblical scholarship and theology and cutting-edge counseling and neuroscience. I'm so excited about this. And now, without further ado, it's my privilege to call Dr. Kathleen O'Connor to the podium. Dr. O'Connor.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. Thank you, Michelle Springer. Thank you, everybody who made this occasion possible. And thank you all for coming. It's a deeply felt honor to be here with you and to be in classes all day. So if my voice goes, I will blame Michelle Springer, Michal Springer for that. Traumatic suffering is an experience very close to home to New Yorkers after the 9/11 assaults, then Hurricane Sandy, and recently the massacre in Newtown, Connecticut, to name but a few. Jewish history, ancient and modern, is deeply saturated with traumatic suffering. I have been reading trauma and disaster theories, much of which emerges from reflections on the Shoah and other disasters of the 20th century. Trauma and disaster studies involve interdisciplinary conversation among literary critics, anthropologists, sociologists, psychologists, and now I know neuroscientists, among others, who study the effects of traumatic violence upon individuals and communities. Before I begin, I must make clear that I am an interpreter of biblical texts who steals from other fields to illuminate the texts that I love, in this case, the book of the prophet Jeremiah. I'm an interloper here, but that never stops me. By traumatic suffering, I am not referring to the ordinary human pains, the life and death issues that occur in the course of our lives. I am speaking about suffering that overwhelms human capacities to cope, that overwhelms nearly everything. Disaster, as I use it, refers to trauma inflicted upon whole communities. The book of Jeremiah is a response to such cataclysmic suffering. Before we proceed, let me see a show of hands. How many have ever tried to read the book of the prophet Jeremiah? Oh, the kingdom of heaven has come. My goodness. Well, if you have, perhaps you noticed that the book is misogynist in its representations of women. Its many speaking voices contradict each other. Its multiple literary genres mingle together in a kind of mishmash. Its conflicting and harsh portraits of the divine one stop us in our tracks, some of us anyway, and then it refuses to put things in chronological order. Yet, in light of trauma and disaster studies, these very difficulties emerge as acts of resilience, tactics of survival in a work of literary and theological art. This difficult book makes a future possible for the people of Judah, and perhaps it also helps us understand traumas that occur within and around us. So wait till I get situated here. What disaster are we talking about with the book of Jeremiah? In a nutshell, we could spend 2 weeks on this. In a nutshell, during the 6th century BCE, Judah and Jerusalem were invaded 3 times by the Babylonian Empire. After a siege of 2 years, the city of Jerusalem was effectively destroyed, the government decapitated, many political and religious leaders deported to Babylon, and people who stayed in the land were among those often displaced. And now the land is controlled by a foreign empire. At the least, the nation was decapitated, and the survival of the Judean people was in question. Actually, in serious doubt. Thank you very much. I'm trying to see it and speak. I can't see around the microphone. That's my problem. That's all right. So, in the book of Jeremiah, references to disaster appear as prophetic predictions about the future. But in fact, the disaster has already happened for the book's readers. We know this from its opening verses. These are the words of the prophet Jeremiah in the days of King Josiah and many other kings until the captivity of Jerusalem. So the readers have already experienced the captivity of Jerusalem. Other biblical texts also bear witness to the catastrophic nature of the nation's collapse. Lamentations is one, the book of Ezekiel, and parts of Isaiah. What trauma and disaster studies do is to help us imagine the pain and terror of this history, and to use Professor Amy Kalmanovsky's language, to glimpse the horrors that gave rise to the book. We can then ask what it would be like to live through this period, and what victims of trauma and disaster need to survive. After traumatic violence, typical lingering effects can hamper survival. At the heart of traumatic experience is a void, a lacuna, an empty spot in the mind, a kind of whirling dislocation, because people cannot take in traumatic violence as it's happening. If you've ever been in an automobile accident, even a minor one, you'll have a sense of what it's like. It's so hard to recount what happened. What happened first? What happened second? Oh, I don't know. The mind shuts down. People shut down mentally and emotionally in an automatic self-protective response. People cannot absorb the blows. At the same time, the memories of traumatic events imprint themselves on the brain in memories that splinter and fragment, giving little glimpses of events that, as you know from language of shell shock and PTSD, these memories can be re-triggered at any time, as if the violence were still happening. So the result is that people lose the capacity to speak about what happened. They cannot put their experience into a narrative of events, nor understand how and why it could happen. Consider, for example, TV interviews after natural disasters, maybe even after Hurricane Sandy. They all say the same things, the people who make it through. It was awful. It was horrible. It was overwhelming. We can't believe it. I don't know how to talk about it. And then people run out of vocabulary and become mute. They do not have the language to talk about it because the language for it has been overwhelmed. Another lingering effect of disaster is that people cannot grieve their many losses because their emotions have shut down. In biblical terms, their hearts have turned to stone. When this continues, survivors live in a kind of half-life, unable to flourish because they are stuck, unable to grieve, unable to thrive. A third typical consequence of trauma and disaster, and this is important for my work, is that it overwhelms faith and trust in God, in other people, and in traditions and institutions that supported life, perhaps for centuries. Disasters can leave people rudderless, free-floating in a cosmos without meaning. For example, where was God in all this? How could God let beloved Jerusalem be destroyed? How could God let the king be imprisoned in Babylon after promising that a son of David would sit on the throne forever? How could God let the Babylonians possess the land that was promised to Abraham and Sarah and their descendants? The invasions did more than destroy lives and cities. They also destroyed faith that glued the people of Judah together. So, what do victims need to survive and not be absorbed into the Babylonian Empire? Well, of course, the obvious thing is the first thing people need is safety, physical safety, and that's not part of the biblical concern. We assume that's begun to happen. But after that come needs of a different sort, needs of emotional safety and of the explanation of meaning. I'm going to mention 4 of these needs if life is to go on. But I want to insist that as we think about the book of Jeremiah, nothing proceeds in a straight line. For example, it's not first this and then that and then the next step. It's not like that at all. It all merges together in threads that overlap in the literature and I think overlap in the experience of the victims. So here are the 4. People need language to talk about what happened, yet does not re-traumatize them. That is, put them back in the original violence. They need explanation. They need to know why this happened. They need to be able to begin to touch their grief. They need to be able to mourn. And of course, they need to rebuild trust in God and the tradition. So, first, victims of disaster need to discover language to get the horrors outside of themselves, to begin to see the reality of the destruction. What Jeremiah does, if this book does nothing else, is that it creates language to speak about the catastrophe. The book tells events in poetic, symbolic language, but it avoids literal reports of the facts, except for a couple of chapters. Instead, the book creates what I'm going to call alternative literary realities. Tom Hooper, the producer of the movie Les Miserables, talks about alternative realities in an interview on NPR in December, and perhaps you heard it. He spoke about the sadness of the story of Les Mis and how it makes people cry. The movie tells the story in song, he says, to create an alternative to ordinary life so viewers, us, can connect our lives with the story on the screen. They are not really crying for the characters, but for themselves. They see their own sadness in the character's suffering, and therefore, according to Hooper, the movie is cathartic. Now, by way of contrast, the book of Jeremiah is more than cathartic. It addresses a broken world for the sake of survival, and its alternative worlds evoke the disaster, but tell it at a slant. I'm borrowing here language of Emily Dickinson, who writes about poetry in general. Tell the whole truth, but tell it slant. To me, that means to tell it indirectly, to go at it as if from the corner of your vision. I'm going to talk about 2 ways that Jeremiah creates language where I think he's telling it at a slant to help the people begin to come to terms with what's happened to them. And the first I call Jeremiah's war poems. And if you want to know where they are in the book, come to me afterwards. I'm not going to read numbers to you. Jeremiah's war poems talk about the Babylonian invasions as mythic battles. I call them mythic because they're not battles between 2 real nations, Babylon and Judah, but between a heavenly army, sometimes called the foe from the north, and a woman. The foe from the north, of course, originates in ancient Near Eastern mythology, and in Jeremiah, the foe is a superhuman, unstoppable, invading force. He comes on clouds. His chariots ride the wind like eagles. Stomping horses and trumpets muster the troops in the distance. The one under attack is the other mythic figure I want to talk about, the daughter of Zion. She is the city of Jerusalem personified as a woman and portrayed in places in Jeremiah as God's beloved wife. Of course, naming cities as women was a typical practice in the ancient world. The war poems of Jeremiah do not present real war. They provide fractured, fragmented glimpses of war. The poetry is violent But it helps the traumatized, I propose, by setting their suffering outside them in an alternate poetic world, as if it were on a stage, as if it were happening to someone else. Because the war takes place in this imagined poetic world, survivors can enter their own experiences from a distance, where it is cut up into approachable pieces, giving scattered glances at the terrors. This poetic process brings trauma and disaster into speech, but perhaps also keeps readers from being utterly re-traumatized by a direct recording of events. Okay, that's the first way. The second way Jeremiah creates language that is at a slant about what's happened to them are what I call the broken family poems. They're usually called the broken marriage poems. Some are in the beginning and they continue through several chapters. They tell of another kind of war, perhaps more familiar to us, a small domestic one between a husband and a spouse, a husband and a wife. And the husband in this case is God, and the wife is Judah, Jerusalem, the daughter of Zion. In these poems, God accuses his wife of adultery, of seeking other lovers. He casts her off in divorce. The family battle and the military battle are interwoven through the poetry, but they finally merge in a text that's very difficult. And in the classroom at this point, I usually warn students that if they've ever been physically assaulted, you may want to close your ears for a couple of paragraphs while I describe the next poem that I wish to speak about. In one poem, in chapter 13, God rapes the daughter of Zion, God's own beloved. Although this horrible language to speak of the Holy One is in some ways despicable, it is apt language for warfare. War is rape on a national scale, terrifying, violent, intimately destructive and shaming. This text of terror, as Phyllis Tribble, who was once across the street at Union, taught us to name texts with violence against women, this text tells the truth about war. The violence, in my opinion, is the point of the imagery. It expresses Judah's history symbolically. It draws traumatic memories into a narrative, into new speech for a speech-destroying disaster, but still as if it's happening on a stage, on a screen, to other people. The poems provide glimpses of violent experience in piecemeal fashion and poetic style. Jeremiah's poetry is not literal representation, it is literary and theological art. Okay, now, second. Not the second way he talks about violence, that's all over the book, but here's a second thing that survivors need. Besides requiring language to speak about the disaster, they also need explanation. They need to know why it happened. And again, if you watch television after some kind of disaster, the first thing people do is start to blame somebody. Because the humans need cause and effect, explanation, interpretation. In the poem I was just talking about, the disaster is said to happen as punishment for Judah's sin. The people were unfaithful. They brought it on themselves. And the one who punishes, commands the army, and assaults the city is the Holy One, Adonai. In the ancient Near East, where this text comes from, ancient Israel, this way of thinking made some sense. To be defeated in battle meant that your God was defeated by a more powerful God of somebody else. It meant that your God was a weakling, a failed deity, or perhaps has simply abandoned you. The reliability, power, and authority of Adonai are at stake. Jeremiah's poetry asserts that God did not lose the war. Instead, God used the Babylonians to punish the people for infidelity and failed Torah observance. Despite appearances to the contrary, this way of interpreting events affirms that God remains in control of the world and in relationship with the people. This perspective greatly surprised me in my studies about trauma and disaster. For disaster victims, even a partial explanation or a misguided interpretation is better than no explanation at all, at least for the short term. Without explanation, without a why, without cause and effect, victims live perched over an abyss where nothing has solidity, where violence swirls around, ready to recapture them. Yet for many modern thinkers, this view is not a satisfactory explanation of the carnage of battle and the collapse of life. Post-Enlightenment us, or some of us anyway, we recognize that there are many causes of defeat in war. Greed, aggrandizing empire, failed politics, weak leaders, economic problems, there's a list. But in Jeremiah's poetry, God brings the punishment to correct, to discipline, and to set the people back on the right course. Some call this blaming the victim. They brought it on. But surprisingly, when Jeremiah gives the people responsibility for events, he helps them. A contemporary psychologist named Romy Janoff-Bullman illustrates this point for me. She says that victims of trauma, even people who receive something like an extreme medical diagnosis, they do better emotionally if they take some responsibility for their fate, even if they are wrong. Explanations like this provide a sense of safety and stability in a world that has lost all sense of safety and stability. When Jeremiah places responsibility on his own people, he is an insider interpreting reality, or at least the book and its composers are insiders interpreting reality. The book pushes them away from passive victimhood and makes them agents of their own lives. It gives them a sense of control. If they brought this disaster about by their behavior, they can alter it by changing their behavior in the future. Such an understanding of catastrophe arises from the thick of the struggle, and I'd like to call it an ad hoc theology, a for-the-moment theology. And here's what I think it is not. It's not, in my opinion, a literal ontological statement about who God is, about the divine being, nor is it a sufficient way to understand the way the Holy One is involved in human life. It functions, as Robert Frost says about poetry, as a temporary stay against confusion. It's a pastoral intervention, believe it or not. It's a stammering towards speech about God that keeps God alive when all evidence points to the contrary. And by keeping their God alive, Jeremiah keeps the people of Judah alive as a community bound to its God. Moving to a third need of victims of trauma and disaster. They need to access grief for all that has been lost. It is no accident that the book of Jeremiah overflows with weeping. Jeremiah is called the weeping prophet, you may know. Psychic numbing afflicts Jeremiah's audience, and I think that is so because tears and laments course thickly through the book. Everyone weeps. Jeremiah, the earth, the mountains, God. So here's a poem about it. For the shattering of the daughter of my people, I am shattered, and I grow leaden in spirit, and dismay overtakes me. Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there? Why then has the health of the daughter of my people not been restored? Who will make my head waters and my eyes a fountain of tears, that I might weep day and night for the slain daughter of my people? Interpreters fight over the identity of the speaker in these verses, and there's more than one candidate. But I think the speaker is either the prophet or God, and for exegetical reasons that I will spare you, I vote for the latter. What I notice is that the speaker needs help to weep. Either God or Jeremiah, speaking on God's behalf, is unable to shed tears. Who will make my head waters and my eyes a fountain of tears? No one can weep. The grief-stricken speaker desires to weep but cannot. I think this is daring creative poetry that imagines the people's traumatized condition within the character of the Holy One. It is a poetic mirror to their condition, and I believe it invites them to grieve. Writing about refugees and Holocaust survivors, Caroline Moorhead provides another reason why survivors and victims need invitation to grieve. She says because they are in limbo, and because all their concentration and energy have to go into surviving and helping their children survive, they feel they have no permission to grieve. Perhaps this is why God summons the mourning women to come in the book of Jeremiah. Mourning women had the task in ancient Israel and in some parts of our world today to provoke grief, to kickstart the mourning process. God addresses readers directly and says, "Consider and call for the mourning women to come." The command "consider" suggests hesitation to mourn, that people have to be persuaded to do so. But the call is urgent. Let the mourning women hurry and raise a lament over us so that our eyes may run down with tears and our eyelids overflow with water. Since the tears are for the entire nation, the task is enormous. Death has climbed into our windows, has come into our palaces to cut off the infant outside and the young men in the streets. To instigate such weeping, the mourning women have to enlist support. They have to train their daughters and teach their neighbors how to raise a dirge. The call to mourn seems to be asking for the impossible, but I think it's a call for courage, for living into the truth of loss. Grieving, then, becomes a moral act, a slow and painful process that may open the door to life. And notice how in these poems, God is no longer angry, punishing, or abusive. God suffers with the people, calling them back from benumbed lives and paralyzing grief toward tears, that is, toward feeling and living again. This depiction of God provides survivors with an image of safety because the Holy One enters their condition and models a way through. These poems are works of art, poetry of silence and resilience. Now, finally, my fourth point about what victims need. To survive as a people, victims have to rebuild trust in God, the world, and their institutions. They need the past, not reimposed, but reinvigorated. In disasters, the ancient traditions fail to protect. The God who loved us failed to protect us. The God who loved Jerusalem and dwelled in the temple failed to protect us. It's collapsed. To survive well, you cannot simply reassert the tradition, but neither can a people start from scratch, nor merely accept the tradition of neighbors if they are to stay the same people. To stay themselves, they must find some continuity with past traditions. And the easiest example of this process for me in Jeremiah is a text that has been a crux of Jewish-Christian dialogue and too often abused by Christians in thinking and practice. And this is the passage of the New Covenant in Jeremiah 31 and following. I'm going to read some of it. Okay, but remember first, the covenant seems to have failed. The covenant with Moses has failed. So, the days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. It will not be like the old one that I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to bring them to the land of Egypt, the covenant they broke, though I am their husband. But this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel. I will put my Torah, my law, within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. No longer shall they teach one another or say, know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least to the greatest. In these verses, Jeremiah takes the old tradition of God's covenant with Moses on Mount Sinai and respins it, retells it, alters it enough to make a new beginning, even as he holds firmly to the past. It's brilliant, it's conservative, and it's new. Along with many others, though, I ask, what is new about the new covenant in Jeremiah? And of course, the answer is very little. The Torah given to Moses is still alive, only now it's not only on tablets, but it's written on hearts. God is still their God, and they are still God's people. That's an old covenant formulation. It's a formula that shows up throughout many books when we're talking about relationship of Judah and God, Israel and God. I will be your God and you shall be my people. It's reiterated here. Only now it's more intimate. It's like a marriage that fell apart to be renewed to be even better. Rabbi Heschel said that when God gives humans a new heart, the new covenant will accomplish the complete transformation of every individual. In Jeremiah, that transformation remakes the community, so the people of Judah will survive and be regenerated as God's own people. I believe that the Jews preserve this text because it preserves and revives Judaism. And this work of theological art enables the birth of Christianity and Islam. I'm going to say daringly that without this book and a few others, we would not be here, any of us, at least in the same configuration of people who are religious believers or hope to be religious believers or used to be religious believers, however it works. Trauma exists. Okay, these are my conclusions. Trauma exists in many ways within and around us as unresolved suffering in our families, in our childhoods, from our forgotten ancestors. It is not only returning soldiers who suffer the effects of trauma, but also the incarcerated, the abused, the neglected child at home, survivors of natural disasters, automobile accidents, and perhaps we have abandoned ourselves and become numb to our own pain, and if that's the case, inevitably we are numb to the pain of others. Reading Jeremiah with the help of trauma and disaster studies helps make sense of this beautiful book. It is a work of recovery that interprets events, provides explanation, and enables the destroyed community to survive in the aftermath of horrors. The book stands as a remembrance of terrible pain of the people whose search for God continues to inspire believers today. It honors sorrow by presenting it, making space for it, finding speech for it. It bears witness to pain and loss. By that, I do not mean it simply talks about it, but it mirrors pain back to readers, indirectly, at a slant, and in doing so, it gives dignity to them in the midst of their suffering. The book points toward new life, toward hope in the renewed life with God, but not until it faces the reality of abandonment. The book of Jeremiah shows us that recovery is a long process that may take generations. It is in that crucible of pain where life begins. To survive disaster and its effects requires the remaking of language, a turning of suffering into words and images, and in the terms of the philosopher Michel Foucault, it invents speech removed from the shores of facticity. That's a mouthful, but I love it. It invents speech. He didn't say that about Jeremiah. He said that about something else. It invents speech removed from the shores of facticity. Therefore, this book is the work of poets, artists, and like the work of musicians, more than dogmaticians, preachers, and literalists. Perhaps we should be funding arts in the schools more thoroughly. That's aside, put that in parentheses. Of course, in the end, there are no words adequate to such suffering. The book remains a search for words, a stammering toward the unsayable, and a journey toward the finally unnameable Holy One. Thank you very much for your attention.
Good evening, and thank you very much for that. That was amazing. My disclosure is that I'm not a theologian. And thank you very much for saying that the book of Jeremiah was confusing and disorganized, because I tried to read it just last night, actually. But that's okay. What I'd like to do is focus my remarks on two themes that were raised. First, the idea that the trauma survivor is somehow responsible for the trauma. And second, that the narrative of trauma itself can be traumatizing. In this case, I want to touch on how Jeremiah was affected by the prophecies that he recounted, and how his reactions resulted in the transformation from trauma to recovery. So God sends Jeremiah to tell the Israelites that they have forsaken him by worshiping other gods. This is an egregious transgression, and if they do not repent, they will deserve and receive punishment. So the setup here is that God is just, and justice requires punishment that will come in the form of a massive traumatic destruction. But the destruction can be prevented by human action. So on the one hand, this gives people a sense of control. On the other hand, it shifts the burden from the actual perpetrator of destruction to the victim. It is the victim who could prevent trauma from occurring. So the victim effectively, the true perpetrator, or if not the perpetrator, the one who really caused the event to occur. Now, in clinical settings, you would be surprised how often people feel responsible for the traumas that they've just endured. I work at a VA. Combat veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder are constantly telling us how what happened in combat was their fault. A bomb on the roadside explodes, and somebody that they were in a car with is dead, but it was the way they were driving that did it. Rape victims also believe that somehow something they did resulted in their being attacked. And child survivors of sexual trauma are sure that something they did seduced the perpetrator. Holocaust survivors, too, are sure that some choice that they made, even in Auschwitz, resulted in someone else's death and more negative circumstances. But in clinical settings, this kind of thinking is generally judged to be a reflection of a problem. We call it a cognitive distortion. This kind of thinking is associated with symptoms, not recovery from trauma. People who think this way are sometimes diagnosed with psychiatric illness, like post-traumatic stress disorder. They can't get over the event, and one of the reasons is because they believe they're responsible for what happened. And the task of the therapist is to substitute this distortion for a far more distressing truth. What can possibly be worse than causing a trauma? Well, what can be worse than that is that the trauma is uncontrollable and cannot be prevented or anticipated by human action. It's only by truly incorporating this realization, though, that recovery can occur. Guilt is transformed into helplessness, and ultimately acceptance of the natural order, which is ironically often a bit chaotic. This is sometimes a gradual realization because the idea is resisted. But a good therapist will continually challenge the assumption that the trauma survivor is responsible. It's only when the trauma survivor begins to see that they are not that powerful after all, that they can make space to understand that what befell them had many antecedents. Therefore, their choices going forward are also many, and they can begin a new phase of recovery towards resilience. But first, the therapist has to listen to the traumatic material. And Dr. Judith Herman, in her book, Trauma and Tragedy, talks about the first and most important role of the therapist, which is to bear witness and provide space to allow for the telling of the trauma. But it can be very difficult for therapists to listen to traumatic material. A lot of time in clinical training is spent teaching young therapists how to not subtly undermine a patient's story by making them stop talking, how to stay in the room with the patient, because that's what you have to do to ease their burden. And inevitably, the therapist can have very strong reactions to the traumatic material. And in Jeremiah, there's evidence that he too became very upset as he heard the traumatic material in the form of the prophecy. He talks about his bowels hurting, and in chapter 10, he states, "Woe is me for my hurt, my wound is grievous. But this is a sickness, and I must bear it." So Jeremiah's response, sometimes we call it countertransference, was, and the prophetic material didn't even happen yet, and he was speaking the words on behalf of God. But the response was that it made him sick. So how did he cure himself? In chapter 12, he begins questioning the assumptions. Why do the wicked prosper, Jeremiah asks the Lord. He was referring not to the Israelites, but to Israel's enemies who were about to prevail. It was a daring question from a prophet. Jeremiah was in essence challenging God's sense of justice. In other words, if you're such a fair God that you have to punish your people for their wrongdoing, why do you let other wicked people get away with things? God, of course, does not answer this question directly. He doesn't answer it to Job either. But what he says is nonetheless reassuring. "And it shall come to pass, after I have plucked them up, I will have compassion on them, and I will bring them back, every man to his heritage, and every man to his land." This is comforting on at least two levels. The first, obviously, is that there will be some form of restoration. But on a deeper level, it's comforting because it's a negation of this idea that what happens is under the control of people. Both his desire to challenge the idea that people are to blame for trauma and the beginning of the realization that sometimes people have nothing to do with God's actions form the beginning of Jeremiah's transformation, in my opinion. For trauma survivors, expressing anger at the injustice of trauma rather than accepting trauma as part of justice can often be a pivotal milestone in their recovery. God's compassion is not tethered to the people's behavior. Rather, it is a consequence of seeing them in their anguish and devastation. Without the trauma, there's no compassion. The compassion does not kick in to prevent the trauma. If the people repented, we don't know. Only after God shows compassion and restores them does he assert that if they return to God, he will not destroy them again. But the initial restoration is not based on human action. And if this action of God is not a function of Israel's behavior, then trauma may not be a function of Israel's behavior either. The idea that compassion requires trauma is the basis of post-traumatic growth, because compassion has powers and potentials that exceed those that are possible in a world that is confined by justice. So in a parallel process, Jeremiah himself undergoes many of his own traumas in the book, and his thinking evolves from believing he is a failed prophet. After all, the temple was destroyed. Nobody repented in his lifetime, to being able to accept adversity as having many different antecedents. This is the true path of resilience. Going from a rigid worldview to a flexible, unconstrained one where anything is possible, not only restoration, but reinvention. Now, the few chapters in the book that focus on restoration are very interesting and important from a healing perspective, and they begin in chapter 31. And chapter 31 is actually the Haftorah that is read on Rosh Hashanah. And what struck me most is that there's no logical transition that would explain how we went from the material in chapter 30 to the consolation in chapter 31. And it's in the middle of the book. Jeremiah has more than 50 chapters. So the book does not end with a happily ever after of restoration and comfort. It's just woven in the middle somehow. It's just part of the narrative, part of the process. What trauma survivors need to learn is that they will be challenged again, and they will grow and be resilient again. There's no end point, and comfort doesn't need an antecedent. In chapter 31, God reaffirms his love and describes how he will gather his beloved, now scattered people. He won't just restore them, he will make a new covenant. That really struck me too. And this is because healing from trauma is not about going back to your pre-traumatic self. That's impossible. It's about going forward. It has been useful to me to point out to trauma survivors with PTSD that they have two eyes and both look forward. There's no eye that looks back. When we want to look back, we have to turn our whole body back, and then we can't look forward at the same time. Now, a final idea from Jeremiah is that even while pursuing resilience and restoration, most trauma survivors understand that there's a part of them that will never really heal completely. In chapter 31, the description of restoration is interrupted by the reminder that Rachel is still weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children because they are not there. And the Lord says, "Refrain thy voice from weeping and thine eyes from tears, for thy work shall be rewarded, and they shall come back from the land of the enemy." But it's not clear that Rachel can be comforted so easily by new children coming back. New children are not the old children. You can never really wipe out the effects of trauma and loss completely, and need to keep a part of you alive to mourn the true loss. True consolation can only occur when we accept the trauma for the fact that it happened. We don't try to forget what happened, and we don't let it go completely, but we allow a big part of ourselves to be gathered up again. And it's not really even a restoration, it's a reorganization. And the acceptance that trauma can be dealt with becomes a more powerful reality and opportunity than the idea that it can be prevented. And that is, I think, the true brilliance of the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen, and thank you to the seminary for giving me this opportunity to spend time with what has always been a very challenging book, and your beautiful lyrical prose really helped to open it up for me. So I want to spend my 10 minutes talking about Jeremiah 31. Funny how we all come back to that chapter, which Kathleen discusses in chapter 10 of her wonderful book, as a pastoral counseling teaching. So, as Rachel just said, just imagine, it's the second day of Rosh Hashanah. It's after the Torah reading, and a lot's going on for the clergy in the synagogue, or in the Hillel, or in the nursing home, or in the prison. Maybe it's in Newtown, Connecticut, where it's the first Rosh Hashanah after a devastation. Or maybe it's a Hillel on a campus where there's a lot of kids who are really happy to be in school. There hasn't been anything, communally traumatic, but there people are. The first day, we know the Torah reading is God remembering Sarah, the story of the barren woman, the hope for the future. Isaac is born, Ishmael is sent away. The Haftorah picks up the theme of the barren woman with the story of Hannah and the birth of prayer. So it's a very hopeful set of stories, although with pain mixed in with the story of Hagar and Ishmael sent away, righteous barren women, miraculous birth, and creation. Now it's the second day, though. There's fewer people in the synagogue. More kids have gone to class. Musaf is coming up. People are thinking about lunch. And maybe there's like a little bit of a trickle out of the synagogue. People are taking a break. And the Torah reading is really scary. It is the story, Akedah Yitzchak. It is probably one of the most primordial, confusing stories that have to do with the birth of the covenant, with the patriarchal commandment, with the formation of the covenant and the people. It is potentially violent and annihilating. And if Akedah Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac, isn't a story of trauma that leads to Isaac's life as being a person who suffers probably for the rest of his life from post-traumatic stress, I don't know what is. And of course, there's other reasons why the story is read. The Akedah, the binding of Isaac, is thought to take place on Rosh Hashanah. The shofar, which we blow, is connected to the ram's horn. But I was really, as I was reading this book, and I was mindful that chapter 31 is, as Kathleen so beautifully calls it, the little book of consolation, which, as Rachel pointed out, is tucked not at the end of the whole book of Jeremiah, but it is kind of towards the end, maybe 2/3 in, but there's a lot more suffering to go before you come to the end. What's it doing there? Now, I do have to another book that helped me a lot in preparing was my colleague Natty Helfgott's book. What is it? Mikra and Meaning. And he has a whole chapter on why is the book, why is the Haftorah of the second day of Rosh Hashanah, Jeremiah 31. And he talks a lot about the literary connections between the texts there and many other aspects of the themes of Rosh Hashanah, how God goes all the way back to the beginning of creation, on historic level, memories of violence, all of that. But what I want to talk about today, as I said, is how is this speaking to clergy? How is it speaking to the men and women who are still in the room, who are listening to that Haftorah, who may be reading that Haftorah? So going back to, I think the speakers before me have beautifully talked about how Jeremiah refers to and tries to work with trauma, with violence, with personal disruption and turbulence. And the notion there's so many people who have been either personally or communally overwhelmed, who have been frightened. How have they become maybe physically abused, emotionally traumatized, and maybe even spiritually deadened? Has their rabbi, their cantor, their teacher, their camp director, have those people helped them? How about the people who have not been traumatized but are apathetic, who are listless, who are there but they're not really there? And then, of course, the people who aren't there altogether, but people who are listless in terms of, if they're in second day of Rosh Hashanah, in their Jewish connection, but in their religious connection. Has clergy reached them? And so I'm thinking about the clergy, and in terms of clergy, I'm thinking about rabbis, cantors, educators, Jewish spiritual leaders of all sorts. They are the containers, if they're doing pastoral counseling, if they're reaching their communities, for the sagas of their congregants. They're the ones that are listening to all kinds of past secrets, current painful troubles, and maybe long ago histories. They know the collective trauma that a community may have endured, and they know many of the personal traumas that congregants have suffered and perhaps shared with them, the clergy, that maybe nobody else knows. And in contradistinction to mental health professionals like myself, I go home and I rarely, if ever, see my patients in any other setting. Maybe I'll bump into them at a concert or some kind of public event, but I'm not going to davening with them. I'm not sharing communal meals. The rabbi, the cantor, the educator hears stories and then changes hats, metaphorically or actually, and is interacting with the kehillah, with the congregation, in so many other ways. And so hopefully they're practicing their own practices, their own spiritual and emotional self-care helps them deal with the constant waves of pain and private, quiet trauma. Maybe it's not of the level of the Exodus, the destruction of the temple, the exile from Jerusalem, and these vast historic kinds of catastrophes, but we all know that people suffer privately in all kinds of personal ways. So how does clergy metabolize? Clergy themselves, the caregivers. We've all heard about compassion fatigue. Who takes care of the caregivers? And the seemingly endless cascade of sorrow, destruction, cruelty, and indifference. And how does the clergy stay connected and inspired? So I think that this book of consolation, this little book of consolation, chapter 31, has special significance to the caregivers of the Jewish people on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, and hopefully to all peoples. The people who teach, the people who warn, the people who see the consequences of people not listening and the consequences of bad things happening to good people who do listen, and the people who stay the course. Because that's another huge difference between the mental health professionals professional and the clergy. Clergy stays. You know, it's not like you last appointment, you got to make a next appointment. The Hillel director is there. The kid may leave, they may email. The rabbi is there. The teacher is there. They stay connected. So I think on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, where we're well launched into the high holy days, we're en route to Yom Kippur, we're thinking about Sukkot, the rabbi, the cantor, the teacher, the Hillel director are aware of other kinds of dislocation, of suffering, of exile, of Jewish illiteracy, of apathy, of lack of ethical awareness, of contradictions that people are listening, and they're asking themselves, have people paid attention to my teaching? Has my caring been worthwhile? Has my effort been in vain? Has it mattered? Are people paying attention right now? Does it matter? So I'm going to wrap up by saying I think that the Haftorah speaks directly to clergy as well as to the congregation as a voice of caring for the caregiver, exhorting clergy not to lose hope and not to become numb themselves, to take heart and to believe that return is always possible, and hopefully the next chapters, in the case of Jeremiah, they're not better, but hopefully, as Rachel discussed, an understanding of trauma paves the way to use our two eyes to look forward. That clergy continue to believe that active, compassionate listening, that teaching, and ritual really makes a difference. I would say that of years of teaching rabbis, that's one of the hardest things for them to believe, that they say just listening, and I say think about that word just. You know, just is a belittling word. And active listening is one, as was described, one of the hardest things to do, to sit with the anxiety that's generated, to not lean forward, to not, so many young well-meaning clergy want to fix, they want to make it better. And so much of suffering can't be made better. It needs to be held and it needs to be accompanied. For clergy to stay the course over the long haul, even when congregants, especially when congregants and students don't listen. It is very difficult to see people make the same mistakes and do the same kind of self-destructive behaviors of whatever kind over and over, to do the exact opposite of what you've counseled, and to stay connected and to feel that it's worthwhile and that this person is deserving, that it's very hard to not lose, to not become sarcastic, and not to become, like I said, numb. I mean, apathy is probably the greatest enemy of spirituality. And most of all, I think for clergy to stay attuned to their own inner voice. As I'm always telling the students, take your own emotional pulse. Be aware of your sense of urgency, of your own feelings that diverge from your baseline. If you feel like too distant from someone or too lured in, to know when you are confused, to know when you're lonely, when you need help, when you need to take care of your own spiritual and emotional life. So thank you, Jeremiah, for giving us so much, and thank you, Kathleen.